Today's multidisciplinary advisory committee meeting at the Mission Inn in Riverside. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to call the meeting to order and do roll call.
Dr. Klingborg.
Here.
Dr. Drusis.
Present.
Dr. Grant.
Present.
Dr. Pollard.
Present.
Dave Johnson.
Present.
Christy Pulowski.
Here.
Diana Woodward-Hagel.
Here.
Jennifer Laredo.
Here.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Here.
So all members are present and we have a quorum. Anybody in the public that would like to introduce yourself in the future in this meeting, if you will come forward and use the microphones, but for the purposes of these introductions, if you would like to just go ahead and stay seated and introduce yourself, that would be great. Let's start over there.
I thought it was voluntary.
That is voluntary. So you can defer. Yes.
Ron Terra, representing Western University Health Sciences College of Veterinary.
Gina Whiteside, Director of Animal Services for the Canada Attendants.
Brian Carlin, Chief of Animal Care Control for Santa Bernardino.
Cynthia Kinney, Director of Medical Services, Inland Valley Humane Society.
Ryan Carl Faulkner, I'm a registered veterinary technician with the Ventura County Animal Services.
Heather Scoterson, Managing Veterinarian for Ventura County Animal Services.
Madeline Bernstein, President, SPCA-LA and Shell.
Erica Hughes, Executive Director, State Humane Association.
Nancy Ehrlich, RVP Regulatory Advocate for California RVP Association.
Jennifer Hopkins, Chief Veterinarian Director of the Animal Care, also Chair of Health Chair of the CVMA Hospital. Valerie Pensionmaker, CVMA.
Ken Pulowski, CVMA.
Dan Segna, CDMA.
Leah Schufelt, CVMA, RVT Committee. And Jane,
Maria Salosito, Veterinarian at Alabama.
Marcia Mayetta, Director of Los Angeles County Department of Animal Care and Control, a member of the State Humane Association of California's Board of Directors.
Aisha Lewis, Shelter Manager, Registered Veterinary Technician with Northwest SPCA.
Cassie Hamilton, Chief Veterinarian County of San Diego.
Andy Balthazar, Animal Medical Operations Manager, County San Diego.
Good morning, Dan Sousa, Deputy Director for the County of San Diego Department of Animal Services and also on State Humane Association of California.
I'm Eric Anderson, the Animal Services Manager, County San Luis Obispo, also the current President of California Veterinary Association.
Cheryl Waterhouse, Veterinary Medical Board.
Susie Morales, Staff Veterinary Investigative Humane Society.
Elizabeth Richard Campos, Senior Vice President, Pasadena Humane Society.
John Pasco, UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. Keith Mattis, veterinarian. I am Cardinal Mark Nunez.
Thank you, members of the audience, for introducing yourself. I'd like to reorder the agenda. We've got a lot of folks from the shelter and animal control community, and we're delighted to have you here today. And to that end, I would like to move all of those issues that I think are directly relevant to the beginning of our agenda. And so I would propose that we rearrange items 4 and 5, and we start with the update on the survey of public and private shelters. And then we have the discussion and consideration of extended duties for registered veterinary technician regulations. And then we move into what is item 9, discuss the definitions and scopes of responsibility for induction of anesthesia versus sedation. From there, we'll move back to our regularly scheduled program, review and discuss veterinary student exemption, the compounding of drugs, and rodeos, and then finally, public comments that are not on the agenda. So that is how the game plan is going to be today, unless there are objections. Hearing none, let's move forward, and we will begin with the next item on the agenda, which is the review and approval of the July 19th, 2016 minutes. Any discussion from the committee? Any comments or discussion from the audience? And if there are corrections, additions, subtractions, then please step forward and use the microphone. May I have a motion to accept the minutes as written?
So moved.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to accept the minutes as written. Any discussion? Okay, we'll take a roll call vote.
Dr. Klingborg,
Aye.
Dr. Juices,
Aye.
Dr. Grant,
Aye.
Dr. Pollard,
Aye.
David Johnson,
Aye.
Christy Pulowski,
Aye.
Diana Woodward Hagel,
Aye.
Jennifer Laredo,
Aye.
and Dr. Sullivan.
Aye.
So motion carries, minutes are approved. Now moving on to our next agenda item, update on the survey of public and private shelters and discussion of minimum standards and protocols for shelter medicine. Dr. Druces, Dr. Johnson, this has kind of been your baby, so I'm going to hand this over to you two.
Well, well, thank you. It's great to see all the colleagues here from the shelter community. Appreciate your potential input today, as well as your input over the last few months as we have promulgated the survey. And I'd like to thank Erica Hughes from SHAC for SHAC's participation. Just a general background, the survey was contemplated by the committee and executed by RVT Johnson and myself. Thankfully, a little over 60 of the public animal shelter community shelters responded, and 81 or 82 of SHAC's membership responded, and I believe there was only an overlap of 3 or 4, maybe 5 jurisdictions that responded both to my queries and to SHAC's queries. So taking that into account, the survey appears, at least on the surface, mind you, to be a representation of the shelters through at least the public shelters, jurisdictional shelters through the state. Let's keep in mind that this was just a questionnaire that went out. There weren't any secondary questions relative to the answers that were provided. Both SHAC and myself, the questions were essentially the same. And as you'll see on the slides, the graphs and charts associated with the responses in some cases were almost identical. So again, I feel that this is, at least from the sample that we acquired, a representation of what's going on in our communities. So I think I need to move over here with I'm okay, yeah. So whenever I do these kinds of things, I like to have people ask questions right away. If we get too deep into the woods, then maybe we could cut those kinds of questions short. But certainly it's a lot easier. Yeah, I broke it.
I knew you
Okay.
needed to.
We're back online, yes. So, moving forward, this is the the actual questionnaire that was sent out. And by the way, for those in the audience, I prepared, I think, 10 or 12 copies, and the VMB has some copies in the back as well, and the entire PowerPoint presentation is already in the agenda link on the VMB and the MDC website. So you will be able to see exactly what the questions were from those venues. So I termed this as a superficial survey because that's all it was. We asked some questions and we received some answers and did some graphs or charts relative to those responses. Sometimes I just can't help myself, so I may interject some other things here that are pertinent to today's meeting. Some of us, or most of us who are older, can remember a TV commercial that used to go along the lines of, is it real or is it Memorex, right? So my question here, this is last week in our Riverside County shelter, not far from here. Is this anesthesia or is this sedation? Okay, the question begs. Actually, these were allegedly two unrelated dogs that are typical of some of the ones that you all know and see almost every day in the shelters that can hardly walk because they're so matted. I don't expect anybody to really look too deeply into this, but this is just, I hope, to demonstrate the level of response and the types of jurisdictions that responded to the survey. And this is just the average number of sheltered animals per day in those respondents. And as you can see, it goes from very few to over 500. So, and it seems to be relatively equal spectrum or distribution of those numbers. By shelter type, most of the shelters were open admission shelters, and quite a few of them, 2/3, actually held contracts with cities and counties to provide, or were in essence those city or county shelters themselves. And as you can see on the bottom, both SHAC and my question jurisdictions had exactly the same response rate and distribution rate here on these two parameters. 2/3 again were, 1/3 was 501c3s. Most everybody had a premise permit. I should say the list, the basic list, the starting point for my questions when my staff asked your jurisdictions these questions was a data set from the VMB that provided all the premise licenses for animal shelters in the state. That was a starting point. If it went, Erica can maybe describe perhaps how SHAC did it, but when I did it, my staff did it, if we came in contact with another jurisdiction through our query, then they were included in the tabulation. Just for grins, since it is a topic that we all face every day, the question was asked, are you, by any definition, I didn't want to get into the weeds about what exactly no-kill means anymore, but clearly more than 2/3, more than 3/4 were defined as open admission, whereas a good portion of them defined themselves as no-kill. Same kind of chart, same kind of rainbow effect here, the approximate number of yearly impounds, and as you can see, again, there seems to be quite an almost equal distribution of anything from a couple hundred to over 30,000. Nuts and bolts, do you employ RVTs? Clearly, a third don't. Do you have full-time veterinarians? Half don't, essentially. Of those who have premise permits, who holds those premise permits? Staff veterinarians, about half. Contract veterinarians or a volunteer, about the other half. Almost everybody, and it is the standard of care, certainly, vaccinates on impound. So the question was, actually, are the animals examined and vaccinated on impound? Now, we did not go into great detail on what kind of examination took place. Nevertheless, some superficial, at least, examination took place in conjunction with presentation vaccination. And then there's a number of different ways to look at what the interaction is with a DVM. Certainly, as we all know, there are animals that present ill. There are animals that present relatively healthy that then become ill. And how are those animals handled? So if an animal is impounded sick or injured, is it treated on site or referred to a DVM? So obviously, sometimes that depends. Depends on time of day, it depends on the day of the week. But treated on site was really only 12%. Referred off-site was 27%. And then both, and again, I didn't get into detail, we did not get into detail of exactly what the circumstances would be that would define the difference, but more than half obviously depended upon when the animal presented. And if an animal becomes ill or injured while it's in the care of the shelter, is it treated on site? Most of them are. This is a little more detail from SHAC. So if the animals are examined on impound and vaccinated, who performs these procedures? And again, some of it depends on who happens to be working, what the staffing levels are, obviously. But as we can see, animal control officers do a good share. Unregistered veterinary assistants do a good share. RVTs, veterinarians, and the most by animal care technicians, kennel attendants, or however we want to describe them. So the preceding slide was SHAC's responses. This is my response to the groups that we queried, and as you can see, half of them included everybody on the list. So again, we did not get into detail to ferret that out. That's something that if the board wishes, we could pursue at a later date. But 20, almost a quarter of them by animal care technicians again. On an average day, what's the level of supervision meaning from the DVM perspective? And it's almost in thirds. Clearly, direct supervision and indirect supervision obviously depends then on either who happens to be around, but clearly 28% responded that there's no level of veterinary DVM supervision.
Question.
On an average day, yes.
When you submitted this questionnaire, did you put the definition of direct supervision versus indirect so they knew exactly what they were responding to or not?
I did not. Shaq?
We did.
Erica? Excuse me?
We did provide that.
You provided that definition.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
What is the difference between a veterinary assistant and an animal care technician?
Nothing.
Well, we used to call them kennel attendants, and at least in Riverside, they were renamed animal care technicians as a desire to broaden their job description because they are more than, obviously, as we can see, they are more than kennel attendants just cleaning and moving animals around. They actually do more in the realm of caring for the animals, restraining oftentimes for minor procedures or for vaccinations or for exams. That's how we describe.
So then how do you define a veterinary assistant?
They're not veterinary assistants, no. And the veterinary assistants can be, there's a couple terms floating out there for those unlicensed technicians, if you will. But we clearly differentiated between an RVT and then an unlicensed one. Some jurisdictions would call them.
But how do you distinguish between a veterinary assistant and an animal care technician?
That depends on the jurisdiction. They may, David, you want to respond?
Let me jump in here real quick. It's very confusing, Nancy, and one of the reasons that it is confusing is where there's organizations that actually have written job titles, especially on the government side of the animal shelters, there's actual job titles of veterinary assistant, and they primarily work in the medical centers just like a veterinary assistant would in a private veterinary hospital. I can speak to the fact that in San Diego County, where I was employed, there is not a job description for a veterinary assistant. It does not exist. We have animal care attendants, ACAs. Those ACAs do some extended functions by vaccinating, giving parasite treatments, and assisting the RVTs. So a lot of it is the semantics of the job description and the type of organization that you're working for. And so that's why, as a group, both of them are in the eyes of the law. Whether you're an ACA or a veterinary assistant, you are an unregistered assistant legally, but you might have a different job title depending upon the organization you work for or the government entity that you're involved with.
Thank you.
And as an example, the young ladies that were grooming those two dogs, both of them are at the present time unlicensed assistants. One is in the process of taking her exam to become a registered veterinary technician. The other one has applied to, or has applied and was rejected, but will apply again this year to Western and a number of other veterinary schools. So I think the takeaway from all this is that the description of what this type of employee does can vary greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and from shelter to shelter. And that's, I believe, part of the problem. Oftentimes these people wear one kind of hat part of the day and another hat the rest of the day. And to describe them with 100% accuracy is an impossible task. This is Shaq's data again, reflective of the level of supervision. A little different than what I acquired, but certainly significant in the amount of no supervision by a veterinarian. The question was, if you don't have a staff veterinarian, does one visit regularly? Some of these questions in the next few slides are rather difficult to interpret. It's almost like asking the question, when did you stop beating your wife? I mean, there's nobody who is going to readily admit to appearing, if on the very least, to be falling short of what the expectation generally may be. So they'll answer more in the positive to paint a more positive light. And I'm not saying anybody was lying. I'm just saying it's a natural tendency of humans to kind of do that. Nevertheless, 17% responded to me that they don't have a veterinarian that visits regularly. And even those that regular, what does regular mean? 3% once a month. Once a week, 13%. Again, quite a bit of variability. And some might also think that there's not enough potential oversight by a DVM in some of these activities. From Shaq here we can see I don't know, you probably can't read it in the back, but again it's all included in the handouts, the responses, and most of them answer yes. I really like the one answer that was as needed, once a year with a question mark. I think we all would agree that it's probably a little less than desirable response. I don't want anybody, if there aren't any hospital inspectors here, I don't want anybody to think this. I pulled this from the internet, so if in the background there are some things that shouldn't be, if somebody's not wearing a gown, this is not from any of our shelters. It's from the internet. So Shaq's answers to the same kind of question was overwhelmingly yes, there's a veterinarian there. And you have access to veterinarians when one is not available immediately on premise, on site. Again, some organizational kind of questions. Does your organization operate a spay-neuter clinic? About half of us do, or admitted to. Do they have vaccination clinics? I found this to be fascinating, since there is a legal requirement from the state of California that we shall operate low-cost vaccination clinics with an S. That means 2 a year, I would imagine. But there's a good portion of us, almost a little more than a quarter, that don't provide rabies vaccination clinic. That's all the state really cares about, us public health officials. Nevertheless, 25% of the respondents do not conduct rabies vaccination clinics. Now, certainly, if we get deeper into the weeds on this, the question would beg, well, oh, so you don't, but do you have somebody that, I know SCVMA, for example, does a clinic in Orange County. And there may be other relationships like that were not taken into account in this brief, superficial query. And this is a mistake on our part. I believe that the question of do you offer any other veterinary services, when we looked in detail a little bit on the answers to this, the question was incorrect because a lot of people said yes they do, they administer microchips. Well, it's not a veterinary procedure for one, and I should have thought of that. So this question, I think, is a little bit deceiving in the response. We don't know if Shaq can maybe contribute to this, but we don't know how many of them otherwise do other surgical procedures on owned animals, if you will. And maybe that's something we can look into in the future. Same type, the same questions relative to who treats, and if you offer other veterinary services. SHAC found that 30% of the respondents did, but again, I think that's biased by the inclusion of microchips. Apologize for, at some point in time, I don't know how these gremlins get in there, the superimpose words on each other, but I think we can get the idea here of the variability and the level of response to treating certainly injured animals and animals that become ill. Another general question relative to what we do. Obviously, the respondents that identified themselves as no-kill, we would hope that they didn't respond to this question, or it might have been a question that was incorrectly posed, in that I know of we all know of jurisdictions that say they don't euthanize anything, they send it to the veterinarian down the road who euthanizes it for them. So without going into a second layer of questioning, maybe this is cannot be conclusive, but I think the takeaway from here is that almost 60% use all of these people to euthanize, including animal care technicians. Not dissimilar from vaccinating and examining on impound. Pretty much the same from SHAC's responses. General question again about how many animal control officers each jurisdiction has, and the respondents 10% didn't have any. And there was one jurisdiction that had 28 ACOs. So quite a bit of variability there. Obviously, it depends on how many contracts we have, how big the city or the county is. Controlled substances, ACOs carry them in the field. 2/3 yes, 2/3 no. Do ACOs euthanize in the field? 60% almost, yes, they do.
That question was asked to the same population.
Yes.
I have a hard time.
Yeah, I know.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense at all.
Okay.
Well, again, I mean, that's where I think there needs to be a little more interaction. Maybe the distinction needs to be made clear between euthanizing in the field or sedating in the field, or anesthetizing tranquilizing in the field, chemical capture.
Maybe going to an outside facility before they would get back to the animal shelter, they find an emergency clinic, they euthanize it there, that's legitimately still in the field.
Correct. So, again, I don't presume this data to be exact. Like everything else, oftentimes it poses more questions than it answers. From SHAC?
Again, one quick question. What was the overlap percentage-wise between your question population and SHAC's?
Unless it's otherwise stated. I stated the couple of them that were exactly the same, essentially, at the very beginning. Unless it's stated somewhere in here, the overlap was pretty much the same. In other words, the responses that I got and that Erica received were about the same on a percentage basis.
I'm saying,
people.
Which population? Was their population, did they respond? She got a response from a different segment than you did. That's my question.
Yes. And the level of response to answer all the questions was about how much, Erica?
I believe we had 81 respondents.
Yeah, it says 81.
Yes. And most of them responded to every question, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
But I also want to say that because...
Can you move up to the microphone, please? So you were saying that you had 81 respondents?
That's correct, yes. And those were all members of the State Humane Association of California. About 66% of them were public agencies and about 33% of them were private agencies. But with respect to euthanasia in the field and the use of tranquilizers in the field, we recognize that that a lot of shelters have continued the longstanding practice of euthanizing in the field and tranquilizing in the field, despite the fact that we know that we need the reg in order to make that lawful. But I didn't want to put people on the spot. I wanted as much as possible to encourage honest responses. So rather than asking, do you euthanize in the field and do you tranquilize in the field, I asked, would you like to do that? Because I thought I would get a better idea, really, less interested in what they're doing, but really more interested in what they would like to do and what would work for their agency. So that's our answers reflect what would you like to happen in the field.
So Erica, just to add to that, it is lawful for them to do it. It's that the regs regarding the specifics of the training are still in process. So there is a law that allows the animal control officers to euthanize, sedate in the field. It's just the training is supposed to be approved by the board. So that's the part of the regs that's still in process. Yeah. They've currently been trained for a while under a protocol that CVMA adopted, and we understand that this is kind of status quo. It's happening. It has to happen. But in terms of there being a specific regulation that approves the training or the protocols of the training, that's kind of what's in flux right now because the regs are still going through the process.
So just to clarify, my understanding was that that after the Attorney General decision opinion that said that it was unlawful for ACOs and humane officers to tranquilize in the field, after that came out, that's what prompted our the amendment to 597.1 that we worked on with CACTA and with CVMA in order to bring officers in compliance with the law. But we don't have so far. But the law requires that the VMB approve a training. We don't have that approved yet, and this regulation 2039.5 that's on the table will then authorize officers to be able to do that. Is that correct?
Correct. There's
okay.
a law in the books that will allow it. It's the regs that are kind of implementing that law. So I wanted to make sure we were clear. There is law in the books. We're just waiting for the regs to move through the process. And they are, I think, post the 45-day public comment period at this point. And from my understanding, and we'll talk about this tomorrow at the board meeting, we haven't gotten any comments in opposition that I'm aware of at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next slide dovetails well on the definition of a veterinary assistant, but as the question was posed, the number of veterinary assistants that are employed, clearly half of the responding jurisdictions don't have any. Now, whether animal care technicians take a role in assisting or animal control officers, that question, the depth was not pursued. Total numbers, this is just, again, for background information. You can see the total number of employees that each jurisdiction has fairly well distributed throughout the spectrum, ranging from 1 to 250. So at least on the level of the size of the jurisdiction, there was quite a bit of diversity in the respondents. These are some of the comments that Erica collated. We can read through them. I don't think we need to take the time to read each and every one. Some of them are quite interesting. and some of them reflect the fears that some people may have as to the direction where all this is going. The last one here, I'd just like to point out, that was highlighted in Shaq's responses, but I could not get it to highlight when I made it into a slide on the PowerPoint. All right. They are no longer anesthetized and no longer sedated by any definition. These are the two dogs that were in the first slide. If anybody wants to adopt them, just let me know.
Thank you, Dr. Druses. Nice presentation, so thank you for that. So how we've got here, we've been kind of slowly chipping away at this for the better part of this year. And really, the first part of this process that's been undertaken by this committee, and then in conjunction with CVMA, who also had members of the sheltering community on a premises task force, was we were trying to figure out what the questions were. And so this is part of the genesis of the survey and those results. This committee was directed by the board to look at the shelter issue and RVTs in the shelter setting as well, and realize that there are a number of statutory and regulatory issues, clarifications, needs, et cetera. And so that's been kind of the genesis of the process. And in the packet, we do have an outline of some of the statutes and regulations where there is ambiguity or there is need for further clarification, expansion, what's the difference between a written order and a written protocol, and so on. So that's been kind of the process to this stage. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave Johnson and Dr. Druses at this point as we kind of interface with the shelter community to get into this in a little bit more depth.
Again, as Dr. Drusi had said earlier, I'd like to welcome all the members of the shelter community. I know you have many things to be doing at the shelter, and we've taken you away from that, and so thank you for attending this important meeting. What our hope today is that we can have a very collegiate discussion of some of the issues that are on the table, and this is really our first public opportunity to get some direct input from those of you that any regulatory change that the board is going to consider will be affected by those changes. I know we've had several informal meetings in the past, and there has been some skepticism about and some concerns about what the committee and the board is trying to accomplish. But as you can see by the outline that was drafted at the very beginning of this issue over a year ago, the original regulations that were written for RVTs were primarily focused for those RVTs to function in a private veterinary hospital setting. I was in on the original job task discussions, as some of the people in the audience were, and the animal shelters weren't even an afterthought when we were talking about job tasks for RVTs, how animals are treated, who has certain levels of supervision. And at that time, shelter medicine was predominantly capture, euthanize, and adopt if you can. And we all know today that shelter medicine has grown by leaps and bounds and is on the same level in many areas in terms of the medicine that they provide as the private veterinary community is. But we also know that there's a lot of small shelters out there that can't practice medicine at the same level that a private animal facility or a private veterinary hospital can, but they still have a mandate by other sections of the law, which would be food and ag codes, health and safety codes, to provide services. And so that's one of the issues that we're struggling with, is where is that compromise? One size does not fit all, just as not all private veterinary practices are the same. But there has to be some basic level of care that we all agree on, because this committee and the board is committed to the safety and protection of the animals in the state of California and protecting the consumer. It's not about advancing veterinary medicine or advancing tasks for RVTs or carving out special niches, but it is about that balance of what is best. And Anne Marie has told us in the past that this just isn't something we decided to do on our own because we didn't have anything better to do. There are questions and concerns coming to the veterinary board and to the office about how the animals are treated or what has happened to a public-owned animal when it was in the care of an animal shelter. And so those are issues that prompt more discussions. So with that background, if any committee members have some questions, one of the advantages of having all you folks here today is we would love to hear from you.
Good. If I could just add one more thing. Certainly, a lot of what goes on, as you all know, in shelters today was defined, promulgated by the Hayden Bill. And although the governor has suspended those provisions of Hayden, which would otherwise trigger SB 90 claims against the state to get that part of that big pot of gold that's up there in Sacramento. One provision that's been suspended is something that tell me if I'm wrong, but I would have to believe that all of us share, and that is that the necessity to provide prompt and necessary veterinary care is something that goes beyond SB 90. None of us can, in the animal sheltering community, can live without providing, in today's world, cannot live if we don't provide prompt and necessary veterinary care to the animals entrusted to us. And, to dismiss that because the state's not reimbursing is not going to hack it. And to that end, I think a lot of us need to be convinced how we can accomplish that without RVTs, without DVMs, and without some type of vet board oversight and premise permitting. So I just want to make sure that in the forefront, the impetus, at least on my part, and I believe on a lot of people's part, is to make sure that those animals receive the proper care.
Okay. I have something to say when it comes to the reporting of this, and it has something to do with the way the committee addresses things and the way that the VMB addresses things. And that comes to the way we address veterinary assistants. They are no longer called unregistered assistants. It is the law. And this is a pet peeve of mine because I hear it being, when we had the Animal Rehabilitation Task Force, they kept calling it unregistered assistant. And it got confusing for people. And it is our job on this committee, it is the job of the Veterinary Medical Board to use the correct terminology of veterinary assistant because that is what is in the law. And when we don't do that, we have things like this that cause other names being called in government agencies that cause and create confusion. And when we look at this, we see all of these names out there when by law they are veterinary assistants. And we can look at this report and say there's a lot of veterinary assistants performing tasks out there. And that's what I want to see on the report. I'm not saying right or wrong, but it is how I want to view this report as a veterinary assistant, not with all of these different names. And I get it, they're out there. But I want to look at this report and say these are veterinary assistants performing tasks versus RVTs, because that makes a huge difference to me. And I think it starts with us. And it's a pet peeve because everybody does it.
Well, one of the issues here is that we've got two different dictionaries, you know, we've got.
Yes.
So there are three groups of people that we see in the Practice Act: DVMs, RVTs, and everybody else is a veterinary assistant, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think these were open-ended questions that were asked just to gather information.
But it has to start with us. I'm not blaming any of them. I'm blaming us.
Well, now we can, I think, we've got the raw data,
Mm-hmm.
so now we can move forward and we can redistill that.
I just want it to start with us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not blaming any of them. I want it to start with us because I hear it here all the time.
Yes.
Christy, I just want to clarify, when you're saying that we have the several different terms that you're confused by, are you referring to the veterinary assistant?
Can you get right into that microphone, please?
We can't figure out how to turn it on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you referring to the portion where it referred to veterinary assistants and then animal care technicians? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I was talking to Dave about it, and I said, okay, so we're talking that all of these are actually veterinary assistants, because under the law, they are veterinary assistants. It's just they're different names. So when they say that an animal care technician is euthanizing an animal, that's a veterinary assistant. It's still a veterinary assistant. By our terminology, it's still a veterinary assistant.
And see, I think just because I'm in shelter medicine, I disagree with that, because in my definition, a veterinary assistant is somebody who's assisting me in the clinic. They're restraining while I'm injecting, they're grooming dogs, whereas an animal care technician is cleaning kennels and doing adoptions. They don't do any of the medical tasks that a veterinary assistant would do. So I'm not sure in which portion of the law that would be described, but in my shelter definition, those are very, very separate things. I would never go to an animal care technician and ask them to help me give an injection, whereas I would grab the nearest veterinary assistant to do so.
So that's what I need to know. When it says that an animal care technician is euthanizing an animal, are they the one performing the injection?
Yeah, there's an actual euthanasia training that they would go
So
through.
they're the ones, and that's, so, but aren't they still by definition a veterinary assistant? So they're not.
So I think the problem is we're talking about what exists under the law, and I think clearly when hearing from the sheltering community, we have a whole culture and environment that doesn't necessarily fit here.
Right.
And the only way a veterinary assistant exists, Christy, is if they're under some form of supervision. And
Right.
clearly by the data we're seeing, they're not under some form of supervision all
Right.
the time. So at that point, I don't know that you would call them a veterinary assistant.
And I guess that's where my
Right.
confusion is coming in from. It's like, okay, where do these people fit?
The reason that we're here and having this discussion, and this all started with something Dave Johnson brought up, and granted, you know, we've been having this discussion for centuries, and I just stepped in, so I don't mean to dismiss the years and years and years of a very heartfelt and passionate work on the part of the board and the sheltering community. But we were really looking at tasks, or we would consider them kind of public welfare, health and safety things that have to happen upon intake. And truthfully, in the law and the regulations, there's no exceptions for that at this point. Really where we started this discussion is, should there be? Because we're not talking about, you know, someone coming in for a physical exam and preventative care and, you know, a whole host of other veterinary treatments. We're talking about impounded animals, depositories, where we're taking them in, and for the safety, and we all know this, of the other animals that are in the shelter and the public, there are certain things that have to happen on intake. Should that really be defined as the practice of veterinary medicine for that environment? Now, I know that's not a popular statement. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room that are cringing, but that's really what we're dealing with here. And I think what we're here to talk about is vaccinations, parasite control, you know, even some form of wound care. What is that exists in shelter medicine that doesn't necessarily fit? And how do we make sure that there's still public protection, equal protection for those animals? And there's a lot of reasonable minds here. So when we talk about what exists in the law and what exists in the shelter, I think what we know today is those things don't meld well in the shelter environment. So what do we do to try to make some reasonable steps so that shelter folks can still do the business at hand? Because let's all face it, they're doing it today.
They have to do it.
They have to do it. So how do we approach this with the laws and regulations that don't fit for shelter medicine.
I don't disagree with any, I'm not saying I don't disagree with any of it, but then it has to be defined for all of us. That's what I'm asking for.
Please come on forward.
I just wanted to say that in California, animal shelters are allowed to perform euthanasia without a premise permit. It's pursuant to the reg. So I think, right, in that sort of situation where you don't have a premise permit, I don't know that it would be correct to call them veterinary assistants because they're not being supervised by a veterinarian. And I just want you to know that in our mind, we understand that there are three categories of people. There's the RVT, veterinarian, and everyone else. But the reason we asked those questions specifically is, and we broke it down, is because we understand that not everyone understands that there are just those three categories, and we wanted to maximize our chances of getting the most accurate results. So that's, yeah, thanks.
It's a long walk. Thank you for bringing that up, because in the sheltering community there are a lot of people that wear multiple hats, and I believe you alluded to that in the beginning. So if a humane officer is out in the field and has to euthanize an animal, he suddenly switches to someone who's protected under this law to do that. If an ACO is out in the field and the regs start to match and they can use tranquilizers in the field or do whatever it is, then what happens? Does he suddenly become a veterinary assistant for the purposes of needing this new permit? Or is he still an ACO who's in the field who's suddenly allowed to do this particular procedure? We also have kennel attendants. I mean, there are shelters in remote areas that have no vet, no RVT, and no access to a vet or RVT. And so if a kennel attendant by job title is having to help a veterinarian, do they suddenly become a veterinary assistant? Well, for the minute that they're there helping the veterinarian, maybe they're under the supervision of the veterinarian. When the veterinarian leaves and gives the kennel attendant instructions as to how to keep that dog comfortable and to continue to administer treatment, the kennel attendant will do that, but they're not a veterinary assistant within the definition of the law. So what you have in the shelter environment is not the same as a clinic. It's not the same as a hospital. It's actually not the same as anything you've ever dealt with in terms of trying to create a cohesive set of laws that apply to everyone. You have people like me who can't do anything, who in a situation where there's a large pull or a disaster is suddenly worming something. Okay, which I've never done before, but someone shows you how to do it. It has to be done. You've seized 2,000 animals. Everybody works, right? So what are they? And are they practicing medicine? And we all have to do this on a daily basis. So I think, part of what we're trying to clarify here is how to get care to the animals using the resources we have without a backlash. That means the animals can't get care because the regs are crippling people from being able to focus, but allow care at least to the level that an owner, can perform on their own, on their own animal. And I think that that's part of what we're struggling with. And like with the new permit, the veterinary assistant permit, immediately questions came up, right? At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I might be acting like this. At 4 o'clock, I'm not. At 3 o'clock, I'm doing something completely different. Do I need a permit at 5 o'clock, or am I fine in my current job description? Because our duties blend, and we're allowed to use certain, like the euthanasia solution, certain drugs. So that's really sort of what the problem is here. And I don't think you're going to be able to nail it down to a definition, because most of the people in the shelter who are helping animals are not veterinary assistants by law.
Nothing's fitting into the law.
Yeah.
Comments from the committee?
I have none. I'd like to hear from the audience.
Sure. Audience, welcome to participate.
Hello again.
Hi,
So
Erica,
I had a...
Before you start, can you say your name for the purposes of the webcast?
Yes, Erica Hughes, State Humane Association of California.
Thank you.
And so after this survey, I had a follow-up conference call with, I think we had, I want to say over 20 people on the call, shelter veterinarians, RVTs, and shelter directors, to go over the survey and really prioritize the issues that they would like to see addressed. And so I don't know what the most helpful way is for me to present those. There are 5 main issues. So I don't know if this is the time to do it, and maybe we go through them one by one. Is that okay? So by far the biggest issue, which I'm sure will come as no surprise, is shelters would like the ability for unregistered, veterinary assistants, non-RVTs, let's say non-RVTs, non-veterinarians, in the shelter to be able to perform routine health tasks on impounded animals at intake. They would like them to be able to perform a basic physical exam, administer vaccines, administer prophylactic medicine for parasites, and to do some basic testing and screening, particularly on cats. That was something that we had absolutely no disagreement on. Everybody was on the same page. And that would follow in line with what is current practice in at least 50% of the shelters that we surveyed. Even the ones that have veterinarians and RVTs on staff, when I went in and pulled out and analyzed each response individually, only 50% of shelters use RVTs and veterinarians for these basic intake procedures. And I think, it goes without saying that this is not only an animal health issue, but it's also a public health issue. These animals are being handled by volunteers, by staff. They're being walked, and it's really important for that to happen. So I don't know if there's anybody here who wants to further expand on that, but that's the number one issue.
Questions on that?
Just a comment, and I was looking at this material, and we've got 2 surveys. We have some issues with some of the surveys, but I think it's great. It's way more information than we've ever had. I think it also shows us what the state is currently. And as I read it on intake, looking at the one of the tables, it's about 2/3 that are non-RVT, non-veterinarian exams.
So I think it's important, and thank you for mentioning that. So the State Humane Association of California members, I think because we charge dues to belong, include sort of the more affluent shelters in California. And so so I think we need to keep that in mind, that while our results are representative, I think, of SHAC members, and they seem to me to be representative of SHAC members in looking at the results, that there are many, many shelters out there in California with 1 person or maybe 2 people working there that we don't have data on. I mean, I have anecdotal data on them. I've spoken with them. I can tell you none of them have veterinarians present on staff. None of them have RVTs. They rely on the goodness of, the local veterinarian if they can. If not, I don't even want to, it's rough out there in the rural areas. So I think this is a very optimistic picture of what's going on in California.
Well,
Dr. Druces?
Yeah, let me continue this for a second. Even carrying that on, 50% don't have veterinarians, 40% don't have RVTs, okay? Granted, the purpose of this board and the Veterinary Medical Board is to help the animals, protect the public, do those types of things. If we now tie the hands of the shelter and make the situation worse, reality is going to tell me that things are going to get worse for the care of the animals, and that's not it. even in this proposal from CVMA, they're talking about, these tasks and things for RVTs. My question is, what about the ones that don't have RVTs? I mean, and all of a sudden, we're not going to get an influx of RVTs in some small shelters in Northern California. It's not going to happen, period. Well, again, with like a lot of surveys, you send out a survey, you get some answers, but you probably have twice as many questions now after the survey. And that's the problem. And I certainly also, and I'm again not saying this is bad data. It's not bad data. It's just incomplete, just because of maybe the procedure and how things were done. And making a lot of decisions on incomplete data, I get real nervous about. And I certainly get real nervous about now all of a sudden saying the only people that are doing these tasks are veterinarians and RVTs and all of these other shelters who now have specifically made it against the law to do what they're doing. I have huge issues with.
Dr. Druces and then Dave Johnson.
I appreciate your comments, and I'm aware of the situations that these smaller shelters, humane societies, even rescue groups have relative to veterinary oversight. But it's not just those organizations. I know of organizations that have contracts with cities for animal control and animal care services that first they refuse to respond to the survey, and that they don't employ veterinarians in the shelter. They may have a spay-neuter clinic off-site where they have a veterinarian and an RVT, but shelter operations are conducted by whatever term we want to use them. They're not animal control officers, they're not DVMs, they're not RVTs. They're glorified kennel attendants, for lack of a better word. And we need to be aware of those situations as well. It's not just the little people, little organizations, it's some larger ones as well.
Dave.
What I just wanted to add, and again, thank you for clarifying your organization and the people that responded, is Anne Marie alluded to earlier. What really started this whole discussion was that for years on the Veterinary Board website, there was basically a policy statement that what you just alluded to here, the routine precursory exam, vaccination, a little parasite control, maybe a little minor veterinary care and a testing, and the Veterinary Board's policy was this is exempt from the Practice Act. This isn't the practice of veterinary medicine. Well, and then Anne Marie comes on board and goes, okay, you can have a policy, but it's got to be backed by law. And that policy isn't really backed by law anywhere, because those tasks that you're describing in your first concern are technically the practice of veterinary medicine and require the direction and supervision of a veterinarian for anybody that's performing them, whether you're sitting in this room or whatever job description you have at your facility. But I think there's a lot of us and many people in the room that think this should be an area that there should be a lot of leniency in. And I most certainly am one of those that is in that category, because I can tell you anecdotally, and I've mentioned this before in our meetings, I've been contacted by people that say, we'd love to vaccinate on intake, but the local veterinarian is going to report us to the Veterinary Medical Board because we're vaccinating on intake and he says we're violating the law. Well, that's practice protection, and that's not in the best interest of the animals that we serve. And so part of the problem is taking this policy that's been floating around for years, which was just an opinion. Whether it ever went by legal counsel, I have no idea. But that policy's been floating out there. People are complying with that, have fit their shelter practices. Because my concern, like you, Dr. Grant, is that California has 58 counties, and they range from millions of people in the counties to thousands of people in the counties. And the level of care, or they all have that responsibility of having some type of animal shelter. We've got to figure out a system where we can get that care delivered.
Bill?
One other perspective here, too. is, this is herd health, okay? While we'd like to look at every case individually, and being a veterinarian, I'm a strong proponent of that, the fact of the matter is, this is herd health. This is really no different than a large animal food producer going out, looking at his herd. He's got a problem. There's a veterinarian that's got a valid VCPRN, and he calls that veterinarian and says, look, we've got some problems. Can you send some medicine? It's the same thing on intake. And I never worked in a shelter, but I've had and still continue to have an association with a shelter, a large shelter in Orange County. And I would bet that a lot of those ACOs who have seen literally thousands and thousands of animals and a lot of their assistants and things like that know what's going on in that shelter. And they need to be aware of that, and they need to protect the shelter, and they need to protect the public. And so, again, while I would love to see a veterinarian in every shelter or an RVT, reality says it's not going to happen.
Dick?
I do recognize that, but on the other hand, our job is oversight. And it looks to me that there are entities out there that do not have oversight, and if that is the case, then we're not doing our job. Maybe we have to restructure that oversight, but I would, what I'm hearing under an undertone is that maybe there are some facilities out there with no oversight that maybe shouldn't be operating. And I think in some cases, we all are looking the other way, thinking that some good is happening, where in fact, I think there are some cases where without oversight, some patients, some animals are not getting proper and correct care, and where the public is not being protected. I think that's the elephant in the room, and I think all of us need to, at some point, begin to address that too.
Ms. Hughes, may we hear your second bullet point?
Yes, thank you. Rabies vaccines. Most shelters, or I think probably all shelters, require that an animal be licensed before it leaves a dog or cat be licensed before it leaves the shelter. In order to do that, it needs a rabies vaccine. And so it's particularly in a situation where you have an owner coming to the shelter and redeeming the animal, and you don't have a veterinarian present, how do you administer the rabies vaccine? So shelters would like the ability to administer the rabies vaccine without having established a VCPR on owned animals when they are redeemed.
Great. Questions? Okay. Yep.
So have you read the section that pertains to vaccine clinics in the Practice Act?
I'm not sure.
The reason I ask is I'm wondering if that would pertain to a shelter situation when basically they're not doing anything else other than the vaccine, just the rabies. And as Dr. Ducey mentioned, there's SCVMA, there's a lot of these vaccine clinics that go out and all they do is rabies.
No, that's not all they do. They'll give a DA2PP, they'll give a Bordetella, they'll viral test cats. They'll do a lot of ancillary activities associated with rabies.
Once they do a diagnostic, it's not qualified as a vaccine clinic.
I'm just telling you what goes on.
Yeah.
So everybody agreed that they would like shelters to to be able to administer the vaccines when the animal's redeemed by the owner. And then many, although there was not consensus on this, but many, we need to explore it further, many also would like shelters to be able to hold public vaccine clinics without a veterinarian present, just for the sole purpose of administering a rabies vaccine. But just to clarify, are you saying that you believe that's currently allowed under?
Under a vaccine clinic. We wrote 6 or 7 years ago, a section that pertained to vaccine clinics.
So, Bill, that section says that once you have done a diagnostic test, you actually have all of the VCPR and the record-keeping requirements of a fixed practice, but that still falls under the
Right.
auspices of a small animal vaccine clinic. So you are still a vaccine clinic, however, your record-keeping and your VCPR is...
Which they follow under right now. If it's just a vaccine, no matter what kind of vaccine it is, we didn't stipulate rabies or otherwise. The intent was, if you're doing vaccines and that's it, just whether you're at a hospital or in a park, there were certain guidelines that we set forth, and the intent was to allow that to occur. Again, went back, the discussion was herd health, and that's what we were doing.
Yeah, there is a
But there is a veterinarian required.
What she's saying, there's no
No,
veterinarian.
she's saying she doesn't want a veterinarian.
She doesn't want a there's no veterinarian.
They're asking that
there.
they don't need a veterinarian.
That's what the point is, no veterinarian.
Correct. I mean, I think the main concern is when an animal is redeemed by an owner at a shelter and needs to be vaccinated in order to be licensed. The shelter, under current law, cannot do that unless it's because it's an owned animal, unless there has been a VCPR established.
Well, the point's not the VCPR, the point's the veterinarian.
Correct. The situation would be, it's 4 o'clock on a Saturday, dog was impounded on Friday, the owner's there to redeem it, it's unvaccinated, unlicensed, and the owner wants the animal. The opportunity is there to, from a public health perspective, to vaccinate that animal for rabies and license it. There's no veterinarian on the premise, and that opportunity is lost. Either they let the animal go, which they shouldn't, without being vaccinated and licensed, or they keep it over the weekend, require the owner to come back in on Monday when a vet happens to be there, or they take it to an off-site veterinarian to get rabies vaccinated and then come back.
And hope that it gets there.
And hope that the people actually come back. And this is not a once-in-a-lifetime experience. This is every day for us in the shelters.
Because maybe the veterinarian isn't there till Wednesday.
Correct.
Dick?
Our hands are really tied when it comes to rabies vaccinations. That's totally controlled by the Public Health Department, totally. So we're just, okay. So the regulations for rabies control, for rabies vaccinations is controlled by the Public Health Department. So I don't think we have much leeway there.
Okay.
Yes, Christy.
I thought this was something that we were discussing in that scene, if our RVTs could give rabies vaccines, though.
Well, my sense is that it's an open-ended discussion,
Sorry.
and we're trying to collect information here. We, public health may have one perspective, but is there an opportunity here for us to serve the greater good? So we're just asking questions. It's not that this board or committee's been an obstructionist on this. We are working with the confines of the language and the regulations that are there, but do we need to re-examine those? And that's what we're doing, so.
And I did a little bit of research, and there are at least 3 other states in the U.S. that have some provision for lay people administering rabies vaccines, and it's usually in areas where there aren't veterinarians available to do it. So, yes, I mean that's something I think we need to look at and see what sort of training might be required or under what protocols. But it's certainly an issue in shelters. The third one is that while shelter staff who have been trained under the reg to administer sodium pentobarbital are able to do that lawfully in the shelter, they don't. Many of them don't have access to the pre-euthanasia sedatives that they need in order to humanely euthanize. And I understand that there are a couple of drugs that can be used that are not controlled substances, but they can be very difficult and dangerous to use because an animal will be sedated and then all of a sudden jump up and want to bite you. So that's a real problem. And in some, for example, it's impossible, according to our Attorney General, to do intracardiac euthanasia with sodium pentobarbital unless the animal's been tranquilized. So I think that that's something else that we need to look at if we're going to have people, if we're going to have shelter staff euthanizing in the shelter, we need to give them all of the tools and substances that they need in order to do it humanely. And I know that's going to be a big discussion as well, but.
Quick question, Erica, non-controlled substances for sedation?
I can.
Yes, maybe Alan, you can.
I can clarify that one for you.
Or romp.
Yeah. What Erica is talking about is a common nationwide mix is called premix, which is xylazine and ketamine. So the ketamine is your controlled substance portion of that. Xylazine by itself as an alpha-2 or acepromazine by itself as a tranquilizer aren't sufficient enough for safety purposes on some of these animals to put them at a level of sedation or tranquilization. Tilazol is cost prohibitive because it's about $60 for a 5cc bottle. So the premix is basically what most people are talking about. Some people add a little bit of acepromazine to the premix solution. So that is given to an animal to calm them and make the euthanasia process simpler. But many facilities do not pre-sedate their animals, but it's a policy and it's a choice safety issue type of a situation.
So I need to understand difficult in getting access to it because you can't order the drugs without a...
Well, you would have to have a veterinarian.
Correct. So if you're a shelter that's obtaining sodium pentobarbital, if the RVT is doing it with a limited DEA license, then that means that sodium pentobarbital is the only controlled substance that that shelter has. They don't have access to things like tilazol that ordinarily would be used to sedate an animal prior to euthanasia.
Which non-controlled would not need DEA registration, need a
Right.
prescription.
Yeah, if a local veterinarian wanted to prescribe a bottle of acepromazine with instructions, that probably would be appropriate, or a bottle of xylazine with instructions. It's kind of a gray area because it's being used on individual patients, but it is being used for the purpose of sedating prior to euthanasia.
And my point was non-DEA controlled substances.
There are some non-DEA controlled substances that could be used, but they're not as effective.
Dr. Drusis?
I can't help myself, sorry. So this is just as an example, I'm sure everybody will recognize that this is the elephant in the room because this touches on more than just this. I just heard compounding being advocated. We'll deal with that later, but my goodness, we can't get past the first item on the agenda and compounding comes up. I hear a difference between sedation and tranquilizing, anesthetizing. Some of us have been advocating for this discussion for a long time for just these very reasons. So many of these issues are intertwined that they can hardly be dealt with individually without affecting the other half a dozen things. And you bring up some very good points, and public safety or employee safety is of vital importance. I wouldn't trust an animal that's had, I trust a horse that's had romping and ace, but not a dog really. And if I'm going to give Tilazol baby, that thing is going to be anesthetized. It's not going to be stimulated by the environment.
What specific drugs are you talking about? And just help me understand which drugs you would like to have access to.
For that, I will ask if there are any shelter veterinarians here who would like to come up and.
Well, if I could interject, I think the issue here is also, even with an RVT, to be able to sedate/anesthetize something that needs it. There's limited ability to do that without a veterinarian being present. So never mind a discussion about a veterinary assistant, unlicensed technician, kennel attendant who's euthanizing. Wow.
Please identify
Good morning.
yourself.
Eric Anderson, I'm the Animal Services Manager for the County of San Luis Obispo. I think with regards to the question about which substances we're talking about for sedation, in the shelter setting and probably even in the field as far as tranquilization goes, 90% of the cases that we're talking about would either be the premix, the Xylocat, and Tilazol. In some situations, I think diazepam might be used as well, but those would be the three primary ones that we'd be talking about.
So we were talking earlier, Dr. Grant was talking about hospice care, and that there are some exceptions or exemptions in the pharmacy regs on hospice. And obviously, euthanasia is not quite hospice, but I'm wondering if we should entertain that discussion at some point, that in this specific realm, that there is a different set of rules in terms of medications. But we've got, obviously, access to drugs issue that gets bigger and bigger the more that conversation goes.
Agreed. I made a comment before this, under compounding, and we look at our own section. Well, I won't say I was a little bored when I was on vacation the last week, but I went through the whole packet and read the area of compounding with regard to hospice care. It's off the charts. It's what they're allowing that group of individuals to do. And my question was, is it that way because those people are going to die anyway? You can add all this stuff to it? Or, are we really being carved out with regard to compounding? And it dovetails exactly what Dr. Drusi says. You know what? You can't touch some of these issues without integrating two or three other discussions because they all are intertwined. And I agree. With the staff I have and everything in my hospital, use Rompin and ACE as a premix and trust that animal? No, I wouldn't. And, we do need to look at the benefit to the animal and the safety to the public and the employees. And I don't think you can, I at least wouldn't want to put one higher than the other. I think you need to look at both of them, realistically. And this is a great discussion. It should have happened 20 years ago. I agree.
Number 4.
So 16 CCR 2039 allows shelter staff to euthanize domestic animals, but not wildlife in shelters. And we would like to see that amended to include wild animals as well. And that, again, needs further exploration because I understand that intersects with other laws pertaining to wildlife, but that is something that we'd like to look at. The other thing is that in 2039, there's a provision for CACTA and SHAC to certify a non-RVT or non-veterinarian to teach the euthanasia training course. But unfortunately, it requires that the person have taught euthanasia for 3 years in order to qualify to be certified, which was fine when the reg was promulgated because there were many people who had been lawfully teaching euthanasia in the state, and they could qualify with the 3-year requirement. Well, now you can't have lawfully taught euthanasia unless you have unless you've been certified, but you can't be certified unless you've lawfully taught euthanasia. So the only new people that we have certified in the last several years have been those that come from out of state and were lawfully teaching euthanasia in another state where they were allowed to do that, and so they have been able to gain that experience. But if you have somebody who's only lived in California, they would never be eligible to qualify to be a certified trainer.
Questions? Number 5.
And number 5 is the veterinary assistant controlled substances permit, which I have a ton of questions on. The big question is we don't have a premise permit, but we have shelter staff who administer sodium pentobarbital. Do we need a permit? We have animals who go home with foster parents who have a prescription for controlled substances. Does that foster parent have to have a permit? If you have a veterinary assistant intern from an RVT program in the shelter handling drugs, handling controlled substances, do they have to have a permit? if everyone in the shelter that has access to a controlled substances has to have a permit, then our shelters, because of concerns with cost, are they going to reduce the number of people that have access to controlled substances and therefore reduce the number of people who are performing euthanasia? And if that's so, that's going to put an additional strain on staff doing something that's already very difficult physically and emotionally. And then one question was, through all of this, would the Veterinary Medical Board consider waiving or having a reduced fee for veterinary for the permit for animal shelters? I know that for premise permits, public agencies are the fee is waived. Could we have a similar structure for the permit? But that's a lot of concerns about the permit. And so our recommendation would be that, something along the lines of and people working in shelters with, limited, perhaps with limited access to controlled substances, have to undergo a background check and be fingerprinted, but not have to obtain a permit. Or somehow I don't know, something that merits further exploration. Because we understand that there's certainly a public health, a public safety component to this, that's why you want the permit. It's a controlled substance and you're concerned about abuse, and certainly that's a concern that shelters have as well. But again, shelters are in a unique position, and how can we strike a balance between what we want to do to protect the public and keep animals safe, and also understand the realities of how animals in this state operate.
So the VACSP is something that we will agendize to discuss further. I think we might have an agenda problem if we get too far into the actual program, because he's very close to me. I've got to be careful. Be careful how much I get into this. But just to mention for future discussion on the VACSP program, when those regulations were written, they were written to define that veterinary assistant controlled substance permit holder working in an animal hospital setting and under the supervision of a veterinarian. So it's interesting that it kind of confines that VACSP permit to the supervision in the setting. So when we talk about shelter medicine, where may or may not have a premises permit, may or may not have supervision, there again, there's a little bit of a disconnect between that and the VACSP. But the underlying policy consideration that you mentioned, which is the reason for the program. Unlike some things you read on VEN, we're not trying to make money off of it. It's truly because the government, the legislature, is really trying to control diversion issues, drug diversion. And veterinary medicine is just one of many healthcare professions, obviously, that has direct access to controlled substances and has layers of personnel who can access the locked drug box. So in looking at it from a public policy standpoint, it doesn't make sense that there's people out there that have access to controlled substances without background checks and without some sort of oversight. However, our regulations were very limited in terms of the setting and supervision. So it's definitely something that the Veterinary Medical Board needs to take a closer look at, because does it achieve the goal based on the way it's written today? Or is there another model, again, for the shelter community that maybe looks somewhat different, and maybe there needs to be an expansion of those regulations of the VACSP? So I appreciate you bringing that up, because the one-size-fits-all scenario didn't work well here. And we recognize that. And we knew that as the program began to roll out, that we would learn more about where there are gaps that we need to address, maybe unique or different from the typical hospital setting. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you. So there is some concern about what exactly, and I know that's, I don't think I need to say this because it's already in the materials, but what exactly does 4840B mean? What is, what's a direct order, written order, telephonic order, and what exactly can be put in those? Is it a protocol? Is it how specific does it have to be? I think many people, when they read this, they don't know exactly what it means and whether or not they are complying. And then And then also in, the definition of indirect supervision, what does at such times as good veterinary medical practice requires mean in a shelter setting? Does that mean the same thing there that it would in a private veterinary hospital? How do you know whether or not how do you know whether or not the examination needed to have occurred or not occurred? I think it's, these words are very fuzzy, and I understand that can kind of work in both ways, right? There's a lot of judgment, but I think shelters would like some more guidance in terms of exactly what these terms mean and what they mean to the VMB. And I think those are the main issues. I mean, I just kind of want to close in saying that, I mean, really our focus is on protecting the animals, protecting the public, and really doing what's right. And we understand that the importance of protecting the integrity of the veterinary profession, protecting the integrity of, and that includes veterinarians and RVTs. And we also understand that animal shelters are not private hospitals, and we really look forward to having a conversation and figuring out what works for everyone. So, thank you.
Thank you. At this point, we will hear from all of the rest of you who would like to talk. I will ask that when you come forward, you speak on new items and not just reaffirm what we've heard. We've caught that. So let's continue to get to the meat and the potatoes of the issues that you're seeing. However, right now we're going to take a break.
Thank you.
And we are going to come back and we will start at exactly 11:55. Thanks. I'd like to invite members of the public to come forward and comment.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jennifer Hawkins from Orange County Animal Care, and I'll try not to rehash past comments, but I did want to mention that while I don't know how many of those shelters, speaking to Dr. Grant's point, may have barriers to access to RVTs and veterinarians, in line with Dr. Drusey's comments, in the County of Orange, I'm aware of 10 shelters that serve the County of Orange, and I've only been able to identify 4 premise permits. When I do look at the Veterinary Medical Board website, am I missing one? It's possible, but I will say those are, there is an abundance of veterinarians and veterinary professionals in Orange County. These are areas that do have the availability. So I do think that, speaking to Dr. Grant's point, maybe more information needs to be made available or identified as to, really how many don't have access versus ones that do have access but may not be holding themselves accountable by having that premise permit on board. In addition to the comments that we've already talked about with what animal shelters do as far as in needing to be able to have access to drugs or perform certain tasks, I did want a couple things I've recognized recently, even in my own shelter, and we've even kind of tightened down on to make sure that we kind of close any potential gaps in our care. Is speaking for Orange County Animal Care, we're trying to get the animals out as fast as possible, as I believe probably all shelters are. And in order to do that, sometimes we're releasing animals that have active ongoing medical conditions to pet owners or new adopters who have the motivation to continue that care. They're usually simple things like maybe a pyoderma, an upper respiratory infection, kennel cough, that kind of a thing. And in order to help kind of ease that transition and encourage the adoption of an animal, often medications are prescribed at that time. So you're adopting a cat with a feline upper respiratory infection. We would like to let you know that this is, we've just identified this as being on board, and we'd like to prescribe a few days of medication to give you that time until you can see your own veterinarian. RVTs cannot prescribe medication. So I do think that there needs to be, and we've even identified in ourselves, if somebody has a question or they want to adopt an animal, we need to make sure that that adoption is occurring when a veterinarian can prescribe the medication. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is that our large animal shelter, and Marie isn't seated at this point, but I will say I feel like we might be one of the shelters that she hears about an awful lot. We have a very vibrant community of critics that often complain about who is accountable, who do we go to, who monitors animal shelters, and I've responded, I'm accountable. I hold a premise permit. It demonstrates that I'm basically demonstrating that I'm accountable for ensuring that we're in compliance with the California Veterinary Practice Act. And again, maybe there are some shelters that have significant barriers to access to veterinary professionals, but I strongly feel that shelters should have that veterinarian component to ensure that there is some continuity or some care there. Regarding to the rabies and public health issue, I just wanted to mention, and I understand that it may not be something we have a whole lot of control over, but speaking for the County of Orange, what our public health department has told me directly, and this is when I've asked them about managing rabies exemption requests that come to me from veterinarians in the community, they directly have told me we have zero tolerance for animals not vaccinated for rabies, as it is 100% lethal in humans. So there may be some conversation or ability to have conversations about maybe rabies vaccinations being administered without the presence of a veterinarian. But from that standpoint, it's 100% deadly in people. I would imagine it would be in everyone's best interest to ensure vaccination of those animals with the rabies vaccine.
Great.
That's all.
Any questions from the committee? Okay. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Good morning again. I'm Eric Anderson from San Luis Obispo County, also representing the California Animal Control Directors Association. And I'll try and be brief. Erica has pointed out several items, and I know there's several before you for discussion about consideration as to how they touch on shelters and the consideration of the Practice Act and regulations. Rather than talking about any of those individually, however, I think I'd like to make a couple of comments and look a little bit broader at the issue of why these regulations are there. And I think certainly they do a very good job and are very effective at what they are intended or conceived for, and that is the protection of animals and customers or clients and their consumer interest in seeking care for owned animals as they come to veterinary practitioners, as well as protecting veterinary practices and veterinarians from individuals who may not have established the same educational commitment or the same professional standards and practice compliance. On the other hand, when we look at shelters, it's important to understand that this is a different group of animals. These are animals which don't have an owner. They don't have anybody to advocate for them. They don't come forward with a pocketbook that we can pay for. And so there's many shelters around the state that are providing care for these animals, both or out of the interest and commitment of those staff workers at the shelters, as well as in response to societal expectations and legal obligations that have been established and requirements on community to provide care for them. So these shelters are providing care already for these animals and placed in the difficult position of knowing what the right thing is to do, but having limited fiscal and economic resources to meet those requirements, but still knowing that things like vaccination and responsible deworming and simple medications along that line are essential for providing appropriate care that they have a legal obligation to meet. So these practices, oftentimes without a veterinarian on staff and without the fiscal ability to employ veterinarians or RVTs as part of their staff, are faced with a rock and a hard spot between do they comply with their legal obligations and societal expectations for appropriate care for animals, or do they comply with some of these regulations which would otherwise preclude them from engaging in some of these activities. I, as an individual, or my staff members, could walk into a pet store or farm supply, buy a bunch of vaccines, dewormers, or flea medications, go home and give them to our animal with no problem at all. Yet those same individuals in their professional life as animal caretakers are precluded from doing the same thing by these regulations. And I think, again, the regulations are well intended, but this is a unique and developing area of practice that presents some very unique challenges. So as you move forward in this discussion, I would really encourage you to take a step back at each opportunity and think about really why are these regulations there. And in the application of these regulations to shelters, are we really meeting the spirit and the intent of these regulations by applying them? Or are we rather putting impediments in the way of shelters of achieving their obligations, both morally, societally, and legally, for the care of these animals? And as somebody suggested earlier, are we putting an impediment in the way of those shelters which would like to step up their game and do a better job and expand out the level of care that they're providing, but are afraid to do so for the risk of stepping over some of these regulatory lines? So it's an important conversation. It's a big challenge, and there aren't really, I recognize, any easy answers. But I appreciate the fact that you're opening up the discussion. And on behalf of our membership, thank you for taking that challenge on. It's not an easy one. So thank you.
Any questions from the committee? Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, and again, thank you everyone for addressing some of the issues that we're having in the shelter world, I guess. And someone had mentioned earlier that...
Please identify yourself.
I'm sorry. Aisha Buis, I'm a registered veterinary technician with Northwest SPCA. Someone mentioned earlier that shelter medicine has made leaps and bounds just actually probably 10, 15 years. When I first started at my shelter, over 20 years, it really wasn't even an idea or a topic. Shelter medicine didn't really exist. And I have seen with my continuing education how much we have grown. And just a thought, instead of maybe trying to reconfigure some of the practice acts that are already in place, is it possible to consider making just a specific portion specific to shelters, animal controls?
Questions? Comments?
Thank you.
Yep.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, can you get the microphone towards you, Diana? Thanks.
I think that's a good idea.
Shelter medicine is, it is a lot like herd health. It is, it's not a general practice. It is kind of its own separate category anyway. So.
Well, one of the suggestions in Dr. Drusis's list that caught my eye was, is there a chance we can own and operate animal shelters with an organizational license or permit, rather than depend on one veterinarian to have his or her name on the license, which I thought was worthy of discussion.
Okay. Other comments? Comments from the public? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Kinney. I'm the Director of Medical and Kennel Services for Inland Valley Humane Society here in Pomona. I have a couple of questions. One is, when is the enforcement of the veterinary assistant controlled permit? I know it came into effect October 1st. I'm trying to get everybody on board. When is it going to be enforced? I mean, is it today? Can anybody answer that?
So the law's in effect. What we're trying to do, I can't give you a date.
Okay.
That would not be the right thing for me to do either from a regulatory
Of course.
perspective. We're educating people. In fact, our hospital inspectors right now are out in the field, and I just went on a couple of inspections, and we're showing people on the website where to get registered, how to get
Okay.
registered, what it entails. So we understand there's going to be an educational phase.
That was my question, essentially.
But it would be irresponsible
Of course.
of me to say, as of January 1st, people are going to get citations. We want people to become educated, but at some point, especially if, we've talked about it at board meetings, we've got inspectors out that are educating the public. We're inspecting over 700 different practices a year. There's going to be an enforcement perspective to that. So the best thing we can do now is to get the word out there, and we understand that there needs to be a phase-in.
Okay.
So that's the best I can inform you.
Okay, that's helpful. I really support it because when I came on board, the entire shelter is run under my DEA license. The premise permit is under myself. And so I'm very supportive of it, and I'm excited to have it coming on board for sure. Are we going to cover this? We will cover the sedation versus induction of anesthesia today. Okay. And then as a very, very busy shelter, which I know everybody is in their own way, I just want to say that I support the kennel technicians doing vaccines, kind of an immediate triage upon intake, because we do have 2 RVTs and 3 vet assistants and 3 full-time veterinarians, but we are hopping all day long. And when you're managing an inventory population of around 350 to 500, it would be crazy for us to try and have only a vet assistant or an RVT or a vet do that. Sometimes I do it. I mean, we all take turns, but just in a really busy environment, I think that would be very self-limiting, and I do agree that the herd health is hugely important. When my staff misses a vaccine upon intake, I had one a few weeks ago, that dog came down with parvo, and then I had 5 parvo cases. So I researched back, all the way back, and I said, okay, well, this one dog wasn't vaccinated on intake, and then there was another dog that wasn't vaccinated on intake because it was a biter or whatever. Actually, I'm sorry, they were from a different city that doesn't do it. But anyway, it's extremely important because I haven't had parvo the entire time I've been there, and just this one little lag and really created a mass issue within our shelter. We only had 5 cases, but of course I had to quarantine everybody, and you can't adopt them, I can't send them out with surgery yet because I don't want to suppress their immune systems. So I really support that very strongly. And then the last last comment I have is, it's been visited, but I just want to propose my shelter support and our support about rabies vaccination. I think that, unfortunately, people aren't going to like to hear this, but I think that needs to be done with the oversight of a veterinarian. I feel very strongly about that. If at our shelter, if somebody comes to get their dog on a Saturday and there's no veterinarian there, then they need to come back Monday. It's unfortunate, but it's kind of how it is. That's our policy at our shelter. And then the last question or comment I have is, can we get clarification? It's come up several times, but I haven't heard it addressed. Written order, verbal order, protocol, can we discuss that? Because if there's no RVT on a Saturday, and they call me and say, so-and-so's got kennel cough, there's a protocol, can I, write up medication? I verbally tell them or text them, go ahead and write up the medication, put it in the medical record. Is that sufficient? So if we could kind of discuss that a little bit.
Dave respond. I mean, that's something we've been talking about for some time, and the CVMA task force has talked about that as well. What does the written orders mean or direct orders mean? So that is part of this discussion, and it's a major cornerstone to how we develop standards for shelter medicine. I appreciate the comment from one of the other public participants is, instead of changing everything in the Practice Act, why aren't we looking at this in terms of a unique environment that may need a unique set of circumstances, which I think is where we started, and then we kind of deviated from that. So that is something that is going to be addressed, and I appreciate your comment. A quick infomercial. Everybody should have received the veterinary assistant pamphlet that just went out. If you're a registered premises, you should have received this, and it's intended to educate folks. It's got a chick eating pills on the back of it. So if you haven't received that and you want some information, I'd invite you to contact the board. We're getting more of these reproduced, but every premises should have. Did you guys get?
I don't think I've seen that.
I haven't seen one either.
Yeah.
Okay. Ethan, was it every registered premise? Okay. So your staff may have seen it,
Yeah.
but it looks like
It's
that.
Well, if it went through the county mail, I'll get it in a month.
Yeah, I mean, we get like a stack of this every day, so I could see how that might be.
So it's a really helpful card because it gives you step by step what you need to do, what it means, and what this new program is all about. And of course, all the stuff is on the website. So again, I appreciate the comments, and hopefully you got the card, and if you didn't, you need to let us know.
And I too support kind of having a separate entity within the California Practice Act for shelters, because I've poured over the California Practice Act, and there's so much ambiguity between the shelter and an animal hospital, and I come from a private practice, emergency critical care. It's a completely different entity, and so I think that that's a brilliant idea from my perspective, so thank you.
Thank you.
David Johnson?
Oh, hold on, I have a question for you.
Sorry.
Can't get away that fast. Your question was regarding Section 48, 40B, when you referred to written orders, telephonic orders, or instructions. What would you like it to be interpreted as?
I would like it to be interpreted as if I give a verbal or written communication, and it is
Excuse me, is that per patient or in just general?
We have written protocols at the shelter, but they're only for the RVTs. They only apply to the RVTs, not the vet assistants. And so I would like the RVTs to follow the written protocol. This is kind of twofold. And then if it's a vet assistant requesting medication for an animal or calling me with clinical signs, that I may either ask them to follow the written protocol or give them a verbal or written instruction to document within the medical record. Is that clear enough?
Good, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Grant?
Yes, sir.
There's 4. Do you recall what the 4 are? What are your 4 written protocols?
We have many written protocols.
So give us an example of what they would.
So feline
parvo.
Feline upper respiratory infection, SIRDS or infectious tracheobronchitis, diarrhea in a dog, diarrhea in a cat. If they're bleeding profusely and there's no vet on duty, take it to the vet. You know, they're pretty specific to different scenarios.
About how many, just out of curiosity? 30?
No, I just rewrote them, and there's about 20, I believe. And I included the drug dosing within that as well.
Okay. I'm sorry, are you a veterinarian?
Yes, sorry,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments?
Dan Segna, CVMA. I just wanted to make a comment and actually in regards to a couple of the previous comments. There was an extra handout today that includes a cover letter from CVMA that you looked at your last meeting in July. And just briefly, the CVMA formed a task force at the request of the Veterinary Medical Board to look into a variety of different practice settings and different species, and to help write some regulations that we would submit for consideration by this committee and or the VMB eventually. Our task force, on our task force, we have a number of members, but there are 2 members, one from the VMB, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Klingborg from the MDC, and Anne-Marie are all present and continue or participated in the conversation. The cover letter that we submitted that was available lists several of the issues that were identified. We invited a number of people to attend and discuss their practice, their shelter setting situations. We had shelter veterinarians, RVTs, animal shelter directors that had RVTs or veterinarians or didn't have any, rural settings, et cetera. And based on the input from all of those, we identified these 4 issues that are in that cover letter. So I will say that in all of those conversations of the 5 items, maybe 6 that Erica identified, the only one that we had heard, speaking for myself, maybe, is the first one about the intake issues. We didn't hear about rabies vaccine or the pre-anesthetic, the sedations for pre-euthanasia, et cetera. And I think the ASCP was not on anybody's radar at the time. So anyway, we based what we developed for your consideration was based on input from those meetings, as well as, I would say, comments that were made at previous meetings of this group regarding the levels of supervision and the things that needed to be accomplished. And I think our goal on this particular regulation was to try and address all the issues that have been identified today as far as the unique needs and specific needs of shelters when it comes to the individual animal and the population at large. And our proposal does propose regulations that would develop another section in the Practice Act specific to RVT, or to, not RVT, specific to shelters. Our language does say RVT as opposed to veterinary assistant. Again, I think that that was the way we interpreted conversation of this group at former meetings, going along the lines of RVTs being able to do these things. May have been a misunderstanding on our point, but that's what we were hearing, and so we developed those with that in mind. I don't think we would have a problem with discussing and considering removing that and making it open to veterinary assistants from our perspective, if that's a direction that you guys think you want to go. And then one other final comment on things that were brought up. We have one that says a supervising veterinarian establishes written orders for, and then there's some points underneath that. We use the written orders as a term that's already in the Practice Act. I think our concept was that those written orders could be to follow specific protocols based on the signs or the symptoms that the animal is demonstrating. So that was our attempt to address this issue of protocols versus orders. So I can answer, or I'll be available later if you have any questions on specific things throughout our proposal, but I just wanted to address those main points.
Diana.
I'm a little confused. Are those standing written orders? Is that what you mean?
Well, we say establish written orders. So it would be the type of thing, many of the shelters and the veterinarians that came in and the people that we talked about, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, including the veterinarian that just spoke to you, have protocols that are set up that if the animal is coughing or sneezing, if it has diarrhea, if it's then do ABC. And but the Practice Act talks about orders. So we tried to use that term, which the written orders could be to follow the protocol for that specific situation. I don't know if I answered your question or not. But.
How is a written order different from a protocol then?
Well, that's been the big question here. We use written order because that's what's currently in the language in the Practice Act. But most of the shelter people that we talked to that came to our meeting had what they refer to as protocols. So, it could be just semantics on how you want to use it, but I think that certainly the written orders could be to follow a certain protocol for that specific situation.
Questions?
Okay, thank you.
Other comments from the public on this issue? At this point, our process is going to be to push all of this back over to our subcommittee, our shelter subcommittee, who will continue to work and interface and have captured all of this information, and then come back to you with questions and seeking input. So we're not going to see you at the next meeting with finalized language that we're going to vote up or down. That's going to be an ongoing conversation that will move at the speed of bureaucracy. So you can be assured to have plenty of input. Any additional questions, comments from the committee? Ms. Diana.
I am of the opinion that there should be a separate block in the Veterinary Practice Act dealing with shelters, because as a public member, what's come through loud and clear is that these people are very time stressed and resource stressed. And to intersperse shelter medicine within this Practice Act, which is difficult to read in the first place, I think is asking way too much. I would strongly urge the subcommittee to just break out a totally separate section, even if it means repeating some sections already in the Practice Act, and just being the resource for these shelters.
I don't want to get too much down the road on the agenda here in terms of telling the subcommittee what the right answer is. So the input's good, And I know that we've got a few other folks here to talk about, but again, this is going to be a continued didactic. Christy?
If the VMB tasked the CVMA with a task force, I would encourage us to not discard this, because if the VMB tasked them to work on this, I would hate to say that we are just saying, and ignore this, because it seems to me that we need to strongly encourage the task force to take a look at this.
What are you referring to?
I'm referring to
What's
the CVMA document with 4840.
Or the proposed document, is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
the proposed document.
2035.
So.
Okay. It was a question along the similar lines. I was curious, what are we taking to the veterinary board tomorrow in terms of a recommendation or a comment, and what are we asking back from them? Are we asking for new directions or just a continuation of?
What do you think, Bill?
I don't think we're asking anything. It's just like we did with the regs, it's a work in progress, just like you said, Mr. Chair. It's a work in progress. It's going to go on. See you guys in hopefully 6 months.
Alan and then Dick.
I don't essentially disagree. I just think that the board needs to be aware of what went on, what the discussions involved, and I'm confident the chair will present that to them. The chair suggested that the subcommittee continue its work. I won't speak for David, but I would request that the board provide us with some direction with respect to the suggestion that that the animal shelters be considered separately from the other practice type or types in the future. And as part of the Practice Act, I think that's a specific direction that the board should give to the subcommittee, to this committee and to the subcommittee to work on. Otherwise, we don't know which direction the board may want to go.
Well, I do think that the proposed 2035.5 is going in that direction. This is specific for shelter care, shelter medicine. It needs some work. I think Dan outlined a huge change in it by accepting veterinary assistants instead of RVTs. So I think that was the purpose of putting it in there, and I think the subcommittee should be using this with the idea of making specific recommendations in the Practice Act. I think this is our vehicle.
Hate to agree at times with Dr. Sullivan. It always makes me nervous, but that's what I, about an hour ago, said. Let's make some changes to this document, use that as a skeleton, and see if you can make it work. And I think as we have discussed, the big issue in here is, do we insert veterinary assistants along with RVTs in the top line? I mean, that's where the discussion is really going to corner on, is the ability to do that. And again, maybe during the process of utilizing this, because I think it is well written, go back and make sure that we are on track, understanding the availability or the lack thereof of RVTs in some of these areas, and would that truly create a hardship in a number of shelters? If the data you have is correct and it would create a hardship, then that's what we have to decide.
Comments from the public?
Hi, I'm Erica Hughes, State Humane. I do want to say that we very much appreciate the work that CVMA did on this and the reg, and I think I agree with everyone else that I think it's an excellent starting point. We need to have further discussions and see hopefully how we can fit veterinary assistants into the, I'm afraid of you, into the, I'm afraid of you. into that. But I wanted to say that. But I also, for the benefit, I think, of many of us in the room and everyone listening in their offices, would it be possible to just give a brief overview? We're hearing task force and committee and subcommittee, and how exactly do all of these committees and task force fit in with each other, and how do they overlap? That would be very helpful.
So the Vet Med Board gave the MDC this task, and so this committee then sent that task in two different directions, and that task being essentially addressing the issues that shelter medicine has. And part of that was a subcommittee here, so an MDC Shelter Subcommittee, Dr. Drusis and Dave Johnson, RVT, who looked at statutes and regs and tried to parse out where there were problems and came up with, I think, 18 different aspects of the statutes and regs where we had issues, lack of clarity, needed expansion, etc. The CVMA graciously formed a premises task force to also look at this issue, but from a bit of a different perspective. They were really looking more at the roles of veterinarians, RVTs, veterinary assistants, and also they were looking at the discussion of protocols. And so they have had, they've been living in the same pond, but have been dealing with a few different issues. So the CVMA's Premises Task Force has presented us with a nice document, as we've noted, as a skeleton, but it has not encompassed many of the issues that you yourself brought forward here and other members of the shelter community. And so the document will definitely grow. At this point, I envision the document growing at the MDC level and not at the CVMA level. And then we will, again, as we move out and seek further input, that input will come both from the sheltering community, and then we will probably re-engage the premises task force of CVMA at that point.
Okay, so just one follow-up question. Does the CVMA Premises Task Force report or interface with the MDC Shelter Subcommittee, or with the MDC, or with the VMB? How?
So they haven't. I have sat on that task force, as has Dr. Sullivan and Exo Del Minayo. At this point, however, I have actually termed myself off of that task force, and Christy Pulowski, RVT, is now on that task force. So there are members, and Dr. Sullivan is still on it. So there are members of the MDC that are on the premises task force for the CVMA, but they are not the same individuals that are on the MDC Shelter Subcommittee. We're getting multiple perspectives this way.
Okay, so in terms of the sheltering community, in terms of State Humane, what is the proper entity for us to report to or provide recommendations to, or?
Here with public comment, I think, is one very direct route. Again, this is going to be on our agenda. It will be agendized. Documents that are works in progress will be part of the public record. And so you will see where things are going and what the thought processes are. And this is the right place for you at this point.
And as we move forward, I certainly have appreciated your assistance, cooperation, your input into where we are today. And I can guarantee you we will solicit that in the future. And certainly any of the sheltering community that cares to send some information or have an opinion that otherwise maybe was overlooked, I remain most appreciative of any input that can be presented to us.
Bill, and then Dick.
I would ask the subcommittee too then to specifically address the 5 issues that Ms. Hughes has pointed out, and part of the working that you're doing, continuing work that you're doing then.
And there were 5 main issues, but there were also a few little ancillary issues. They're all captured.
Can we just then maybe have Ms. Hughes get a hold of Dr. Drusy and make sure that the concerns that you have then are communicated to the subcommittee, because that will be your first avenue, and then the subcommittee and you can hopefully, as Dr.
I
Mr.
think
Chair
that
brought up.
we have it, okay? We've got video record. I want to be careful about not starting to have closed meetings and things, okay?
It's not a closed meeting.
I understand that. We have it. We have it on video. We'll have it in the minutes. The minutes will be part of the public record. We're going to be okay, Bill. We got it. So let's go forward with that.
Dave wrote it down, too.
Dick.
I was just a comment that we are very restricted in our subcommittees to have only 2 people on there. We'd love to have 10 on there, or 20, but we're restricted by law to have 2. So that's the limiting factor that we have to face on the board without having a public meeting. So they're going to do some of the grunt work, and then they're going to come back, and we're all going to pitch in, and it's a slow process that we're restricted to.
Thank you.
I'm going to defer at this point, so let's continue.
Other comments?
Hello again. I'm Madeline Bernstein. Just 2 quick things. One, thank you very much for doing this. It's a discussion that was really a long time due. In case you're interested, some of the texts I'm getting from your fans on the webcast love the idea of, instead of trying to put a square peg in a round hole by trying to take things addressed for private hospitals and private practices, to look at a way to create another area that involves shelter medicine, herd health, where you can squeeze things that are analogous to owned animals, or squeeze things in that will best meet both our goals. And then as far as the premises committee, I would just ask that whatever this committee is looking at and that committee is looking at, there are issues. We've had some discussions as to what the practice of medicine is for the purposes of needing a premises permit, particularly of veterinary assistants. We're all afraid of you now. You started something. Or if, again, like someone like me with no veterinary training is asked to participate in something, whether that triggers the need for a veterinary premises permit, or since most of us are mobile, although we're not mobile vets, but with these definitions, one could envision something happening in the car with an ACO and administering a sedative in the field, that we don't run afoul accidentally of not having a premises permit for a mobile unit when we really wouldn't even be thinking of that. So just as somebody who worries that all the juggling balls, land in the same basket at the end of the day, rather than they all bounce off and hit the juggler on the head and make a mess, I think we have to be very careful, and I would ask that there's some coordination between the two, because you can't expand something over here and then not have it impact legally something over there. Thank you.
Any other comments? We are going to take a 1-hour break for lunch. We will meet back here, and we'll start at 1:45. Thanks.